I'm a police officer from Barreirinha, Amazonas, and I've been in this profession since I was 23. Most of the time, it's not as exciting as it's portrayed. Not much happens in my county generally. The most serious calls are disturbances of order, or from time to time shoplifting occurs in stores, with rare, slightly more serious cases occurring sporadically. I have worked practically every shift possible. I spent time on the night shift, and I certainly had some stranger occurrences during that shift compared to the shift. However, there was one time during the night shift I didn't receive any calls. I was just driving on a quiet road with no streetlights and with a vast forest on both sides. I suddenly noticed the reflection of the taillights quickly approaching the right side of the grass road. As it approached, I realized that the driver's side door was open. I started to swerve onto the grass, slowing down and planning to get out to see if the driver needed help from me. Surprise! I saw someone getting out of the car and standing next to the door for a second. Before start running towards the woods, I called on the radio about a person in the suspicious vehicle and got out of the car with my flashlight on and my hand close to the holster just as a precaution in the situation. I had to wait for the worst. I got to the front door of the car and looked. I went inside half expecting to see someone else sitting there, but the car seemed empty. But there was an extremely unpleasant odor coming from inside the vehicle, sounding like a decomposing animal. I called towards the woods, asking if anyone was there and needed help, and approached the line of trees, waving the flashlight. I went back to the car to take a closer look at the passenger side. There were several bloody tissues and paper towels on the ground. Both the passenger side and the back seats were soaked in blood, and the papers were dark red at one point. While looking inside the car, I heard footsteps in the woods. I quickly turned around with my flashlight and shouted, "Get out of the woods!" I didn't see anyone, but I was sure someone was hiding there, and this was confirmed when I heard a deep voice coming from somewhere beyond of the trees and bushes. I had no idea what the voice said. I responded, saying, "Show yourself, you are injured, prepared." To draw my weapon, I got a little closer and repeated the question, "Are you injured?" No response. The voice I saw before did not seem like someone would run into the woods when they saw a police car. Something was very wrong. I went back to the car and asked for support when I investigated the vehicle in more detail. I noticed that it had no license plates. When I got back into the back seat, I found something that almost made me vomit from shock. There was something heavy wrapped in paper towel and bloody. With gloves December, I looked to discover it was a severed hand. It took me a moment to realize what it was, because it was completely dark red, soaked in blood. The situation went from 5 to 10 radio, reporting that there was a possible murder and that I needed reinforcements. I turned on the light of my car to make it easier for the other police officers to identify my location. When support arrived, we did a thorough search of the woods in search of possible traces of blood. However, we found nothing, not even traces of blood. Leaving the car, this meant that the hand and the blood on the handkerchiefs that I found were perhaps not those of the person who came running into the woods. Eventually, the canine unit had to be called to look for the person. Hours and hours of searching led to nothing. The vehicle was seized as it had been reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town who said he had no idea who could have stolen his car. Fingerprints were taken from the steering wheel, and DNA tests were carried out on the hand. No matches were found in the database to this day. There was progress in discovering the identity of the driver of that car and who the severed hand belonged to. My partner and I are part of a unit in the sergeant's department responsible for monitoring ankle monitors one night while searching for someone who had escaped from the program. We followed his last known location, which was a somewhat suspicious area of our county. Few approaches are routine, but this one was disturbing from the start. My partner went to the front door, while I kept an eye on the side of the house. After knocking on the door, we could hear movement inside, and the door slowly opened, revealing a middle-aged woman who looked right at me. There was no way for her to know where I was, since I wasn't visible through any of the front windows. Front or side of the house, the strange thing was that most people would answer the person at the front door and not look at the side of the house first. After a moment, she let us in after we asked if she knew anyone named we were looking for. She mumbled something indicating that Camila was there. Things changed completely when she fell to her knees and began to crawl across the floor, screaming for Camille. It was evident that this woman had mental issues, and we assumed that Camille was her caretaker. We both knew the situation was strange, but we started searching around the house. The whole time this woman kept screaming for Camille, never getting up, just following us on the floor. It was around 8 p.m. and it was dark outside. Inside the house, only one light was on. There were no televisions or any Electronics, the house had a strange atmosphere, and the layout of this old residence had about 4 bedrooms and 2 floors. Every time I left a room, it felt like I was in a part of the house where I wasn't. Before I entered a hallway, it felt like I was in another part of the house, as if I had entered some kind of dimensional rift. Sometimes the woman was right behind me. Without making a sound, I began to question how all this was possible. At a certain point, we both went up to the top floor, which seemed to have bedrooms, or maybe a bathroom at the top of the stairs. When we tried to open the door, it wouldn't give way. It looked like it was sealed somehow, as if it had been painted, and the paint had dried in the cracks of the door. After a little more effort, the door opened, revealing an attic. Instead of rooms, if you remember the movie Paranormal Activity, when the guy finds a picture of his wife and son in isolation, that's exactly what it looked like. There was nothing but storage space. Isolation, and an older light bulb with a wire hanging down. The woman was sitting in the downstairs, watching us, occasionally shouting after what felt like an hour, repeatedly searching for this house, entering rooms. I swore I had just left. We decided to call it quits and leave the property. While we drove away, the woman was standing right in front of the door, staring at us as we drove away from according to the time we called the center. And when we concluded the search, we were only there for 20 minutes. But it seemed like we had been there for more than an hour or two. I don't know what was more disturbing, the fact that it was late at night, the woman shouting Camille's name and crawling on her knees, she appearing silently behind me without me hearing her move, or the fact that she was standing in the doorway staring at us when we left. We never returned to that house. My family and I lived in the middle, from Mato Grosso do Sul. Few stories come out of this region, and here I am about to share it. Makes us happy. Because of this, my cousin, who everyone called Marcos, was a police officer for 5 years. He joined the corporation with enthusiasm and optimism. I believe that as many do, it may seem cliche, but he really wanted to make a difference and help improve the lives of people in his community. One day, they received an alert about a house somewhere on land near the capital. According to Marcos, it was a place that people thought had been abandoned for years, which gives an idea of the state the house was in. When they arrived, an older man was sitting on the front steps with his hands in his pockets. Marcos and the other police officer approached him and were alarmed to see that the man was crying, not just crying, but sobbing and mumbling something about how terrible it was. They tried to question the man, but he was completely incoherent. It didn't take more than a few seconds for them to realize that the poor man was traumatized. While his partner called another police car, Marcos pulled out his gun and decided to enter the house. The smell inside the house was incredible. Disgusting, he told me. That the kitchen and living room were completely messed up. It was obvious that the owners of the house were hoarders. Pots and pans stacked almost to the ceiling, spoiled food scattered across the table, ready-made food packaging scattered across the floor. The floor was disgusting, as routine dictated. Marcos called to see if anyone would respond, but got nothing but silence. He told me that even with all the training and experience acquired over these 5 years, his heart rate was already accelerated. With the gun, he checked the living room and saw no one there. He made his way down the hallway, where the smell was getting much worse. Just when everything became unbearable, he covered his nose and mouth and opened the door to what he suspected was the bedroom. On the bed, there were 2 dead bodies of gray skin and covered in flies. Despite his stomach was turning, Marcos decided to get closer to take a closer look, a decision he said he regretted since then. One of the corpses was that of a man and the other was a woman. The skin on their faces was already starting to come off, and flies were flying towards in and out of their mouths. Some landed and stayed in the eyeballs. While Marcos examined the woman's corpse, he was horrified to discover that she was holding an even smaller baby body, also lifeless. It was only when a large cockroach came out of the baby's mouth. Dead man, who ran out of the house, tripped and threw up his lunch on the steps where the man was sitting. When the other cars finally arrived, they were able to make a closer inspection. The older man, who Marcos and his partner had encountered when they first arrived, were ex-colleague and friend of the dead man. They had worked together at a peach packing company. The man, known as Gabriel, showed up for over a week and went to their house to see if he was okay there. Poor man had been the first to see that horrible scene in the bedroom. The story they were able to reconstruct was that the husband and wife at some point became addicted to opioids. After a surgery performed about a year ago, they began abusing painkillers together, and the addiction grew more and more until who began using heroin injectable and nasally. Their daughter, who was no more than 2 years old, died due to lack of care. When the husband and wife discovered the baby's corpse, they finally broke down completely and decided to end their own lives. The coroner found enough heroin in both their bodies to kill them twice. Marcos is still with the corporation, but he started drinking a little too much after that. He has been in therapy and has managed to control his alcohol consumption, but almost every time we talk, he said, who still has nightmares about that poor child's body? And in her nightmares, the baby is still crying once she answered a call about a possible break in a young woman who lived alone, called in fear saying that she arrived home and found a broken window downstairs, but nothing seemed to have been stolen, and she couldn't find anyone inside. However, when she went up the stairs to go to bed, she thought she could hear footsteps moving downstairs. The call ended shortly after she said this, and the woman didn't answer her attempts to return. I accepted the call and arrived at the small house. I knocked on the front door, and after a minute there were a few more knocks, and I pressed the doorbell. After another minute I tried again, this time knocking hard and ringing the doorbell again, as there was no response from that day. Inspecting the house, I circled the house and found the window broken. It was a window big enough to pass through easily. I put my head inside the dark house and shouted, "It's the police," and no answers. I reported on the radio that the house seemed silent, and then more police were there on my way, but I didn't feel good waiting there in case there was anyone really in danger in the house. I radioed that I was going to enter the house through the window, and so I went through it. I stepped over the broken glass in the kitchen and held my gun as I walked through the place, listening to the shards of glass shattering on the soles of my boots. I shouted into the house to make it clear to anyone inside that I was a police officer. There were no footsteps, so I went upstairs as the woman was on the phone, had told headquarters that he heard footsteps downstairs, which meant that his room was upstairs. He wasn't trying to be very quiet while going up the stairs, but he also wasn't making excessive noise. He didn't know what to expect, if someone with a gun was in, or if the woman was really alone on the bed. I said, "Ma'am, I'm a police officer. Are you here?" And I heard a soft female voice from above saying yes. It followed the voice to one of the rooms where I saw a woman sitting on the bed under the covers. She looked at me, and I asked her if she was okay. She said she was. She was fine. I noticed a slight tremor in her voice. I kept the lights in the room off while I watched her. There was enough natural light from the moon in the room for me to examine her facial expression. She looked distressed. I told her I was answering her call, and I asked her why she hung up and didn't answer the calls back. She stuttered and said that no one was there. I understood what was happening. I looked at the closet and made a discreet nod towards her. She shook her head slightly in denial. I looked under the bed. I pointed, and he shook his head yes. The pressure on what to do next was immense. The best idea that occurred to me at the time was to say, "All right, sir. I just need you to sign this report form stating that I was here, that there is nothing unusual." She agreed and got up from the bed, approaching me. When she was close enough, I pushed her out of the room, and then taking out my gun, I screamed, "Get out!" from under the bed. I was still shaken when I saw a dark figure slowly coming out from under the bed. The middle-aged man, dressed all in black, put his hands up and dropped whatever weapons he had. He only heard a metallic sound of something falling to the floor that it turned out to be a weapon. I arrested him immediately and took him outside just as the other police officers were arriving. The woman had turned off the phone when she thought the footsteps were upstairs, and I didn't want her to hear the audio of the call. That's also why she did not answer the phone, because by that time the intruder had already entered the room and was holding her at gunpoint, and as the police were already on their way for whatever reason, instead of fleeing the scene, the intruder threatened to shoot the woman if she made some noise when the police arrived. After I rang the doorbell, he hid under the bed and told her to pretend her wasn't there. I'm glad I realized the situation. A lot of not very good things could have happened if I hadn't acted like this.